Hello and welcome to the second video in my 10-part series on how organizations burn out employees. I'm Dr. Geri Puleo, the President and CEO of Change Management Solutions. Now in these videos, we'll be discussing how organizations unwittingly burn out their employees. Today, we'll specifically be talking about the role of poor communication in creating burnout. So let's dive into the reasons why poor communication leads to employee burnout. Really, when we talk about poor organizational communication, what we're really asking is, what did you say? When I was doing my research on burnout during organizational change and created the burnout during organizational change model, or BDOC, I found surprisingly that almost two-thirds of my participants overall stated that poor communication was a primary cause of their burnout. Specifically, 64.3% of employees said that the fact that their communication with their employers was not good was a reason why they burned out. Now, within the context of the change initiative, not surprisingly, the change leaders cited poor communication as a precipitating factor to their burnout at a little bit of a lower rate, about 37.5%. But the change targets, about half of them, stated that it was the poor communication that they received from their organizations about the change initiative and the expectations that caused them to burn out. I also found that there was no difference in terms of the type of organization involved. It was about two-thirds of the participants who worked for profits or nonprofit organizations cited poor communication as a reason why they burned out. What I found that was really interesting, but perhaps not so surprising, is that there was a gender difference in the role that communication plays in an employee burning out. Although none of my male participants stated that poor communication was a cause of their burnout, a whopping 90% of my female participants said that poor communication led to their burnout. So let's talk a little bit more about this connection between burnout and poor communication. This graphic is the downward spiral in my BDOC, or Burnout During Organizational Change model. In general, just to recap, employees usually are hopeful and engaged, but then it's through processes and practices of the organization itself that cause them to deteriorate into feelings of frustration, anger, apathy, and eventually a full-blown burnout. So let's talk a little bit more specifically in terms of the aspects of communication that cause this downward spiral. Well, first of all, it was organizational communication that lacked clarity, brevity, and the purpose behind organizational decisions. In other words, when organizations told their employees what they wanted them to do, it was either a long-winded report that, quite frankly, few employees had time to read, or a long-winded presentation, which some employees tended to tune out, or what they were saying just wasn't clear. It seemed to ramble all over the place. And then finally, and probably most importantly, organizations tend to forget to tell employees the why behind their decisions, or the purpose. When all this comes together, it leads to frustration, which is the first step in the downward spiral toward full burnout. In addition, when this happens, employees who are responsible for the implementation of any of these organizational decisions, be it a change initiative, a new product launch, a new tech IT system, whatever it is, those employees started to become extremely angry when they were the ones responsible, and because they were responsible, they were going to be judged on their performance in their annual reviews. But yet they had no voice in terms of what was being done and how it was being done. It's not surprising that they became increasingly angry and then eventually apathetic. They didn't care anymore. Well, what this all leads to is that the organization as a whole misses deadlines, or the results that they achieve were not the results that they intended. That's because when they communicated with their employees, their expectations weren't clear, they were too long-winded rather than brief, and employees really didn't understand why they needed to do what they were being told to do. When this happened, it causes two things. Maverick wildcards emerge in the workplace. These are the employees that say, if you're not going to tell me what to do, then I'm just going to do what I think is best. And they normally don't tell the powers that be what they're planning on doing. In addition, what it can lead to is an absolute dearth of feedback or ideas from employees. Because apathy is the stage immediately preceding burnout, employees figure, why should I say anything? You're not going to listen to me anyways, so I'm just going to save my breath. This all loops back into apathy and disengagement in the workforce. And when people are apathetic and disengaged, there is a close relationship with feelings of utter, abject burnout. And this results in a culture that's characterized by chaos-driven guessing. In other words, the organizational leaders aren't saying what their expectations are, they aren't explaining why, and chaos ensues. So the challenge now is for organizational leaders to learn how to create two-way dialogue within the organization so that their employees won't burn out, they will remain engaged, and the organization will achieve the goals that it's established. So there are two parts of communication. The first part is actually sending the message. Now, what does this mean? Well, the first thing is never, ever, 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 ever assume that what you say is what they are going to hear. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, you need to rely on both the denotative and connotative meanings of the words and phrases that you use to relay your message. Now, denotative is the Webster's Dictionary definition of a word. It's a specific action or outcome or a process that's in place. The words have very specific, non-dubious meanings. However, when it comes to the connotative meanings of words, these are the aspects of language that create emotional responses. A lot of times, the connotative meanings of words give clear indications of what is important or relevant about that particular message. Secondly, storytelling. It's getting huge in organizations, both for-profits and nonprofits. People learn, understand, respond to, and remember things that are stories. We don't get riled up or excited about dry facts. Instead, we want to focus on the story. In other words, why are we doing this? Why are we launching this initiative? Why is this so important? And if you can do that, it creates an emotional reaction in employees, and they're better able to remember and understand the real meaning of what it is that you're telling them. And you need to nurture an ongoing communication loop with all of your workers. Now, the way you do that within the actual communication or message that you're sending is to pause and ask for their feedback or ask for their insight or ask for them to become involved and participative in the communication. But the ongoing communication loop isn't just during the time that you're sending a message. It also needs to be established before you talk to them, as well as after that communication. For example, if you say, well, business has been going really bad and we're going to need to have a round of downsizing, and that's it, employee grapevine and gossip is going to go crazy because you haven't given them enough particulars and you haven't given them a way to respond to what it is that you've told them. So make sure that you have specific communication channels in place so that employees can ask additional questions and continue the dialogue. And probably most importantly, anticipate that you're going to get pushback and resistance from some employees when you give them a new message. Uh, Too often, the pushback and resistance is viewed as a negative thing. Well, in all of my research on change management and burnout, what I've discovered is that pushback and resistance is really a positive thing because it shows that the employees are listening, engaging, and they're considering what it is that you're telling them. So if they're a little shy and don't express their concerns, by anticipating particular specific points of pushback or resistance, you can give voice to their unspoken questions. So in the example that I just said about, well, business isn't going very well and we're going to have to downsize, what is the employee going to think? Is my job safe? So you may want to say, I know many of you are wondering if your job is going to be safe. Well, this is what we are doing to save certain jobs. You've allayed their fears and you've respected their feelings and emotions. So the key takeaway here, always remember WIFM. Now, WIFM isn't a radio station. WIFM stands for What's in It for Me. Always when you're sending a message to employees, consider how they will respond to it based on how they interpret what's in it for them in terms of that communication and the actions that are going to be following. If you don't consider the with them in your communication, you're going to cause distrust with your employees. Now, the second aspect of communication, we talked about sending the message. It's also receiving the response. Now, I'm not talking about the employees who are listening to what you're saying. I'm talking about you as the leader receiving their responses to what you are saying. Too often, people look at feedback as a negative, as a judgment call of what they've just said to someone, but it's not. That's a very reactive response, and you need to be proactive and encouraging of feedback. So what you need to do when employees give you feedback, repeat, clarify, and ask questions. Repeat means to give their feedback to you and express it in your own words. Don't just parrot what it is that they said to you, but put it into your own words. What I've discovered, and you've probably discovered too in your dealings with people, is you can repeat what somebody said and they say, no, 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 that's not really what I mean. I didn't say that right. What I really meant was, the only reason that they said that is because they assumed that you understood what they were saying. But by repeating it in your own words, they could then understand that you really did appreciate and have a full understanding of what it is that you were saying. So repeat their feedback to you in your own words. And when you do this feedback, what you're trying to ensure is that you have the same meaning and expectations. You don't want similar meanings or expectations, in other words, kind of a gray area, but what you're trying to ensure is that you and the person to whom you're speaking have the same meaning and expectations of whatever it is that you're asking. Secondly, respectfully ask questions to ensure that the employees to whom you're speaking understand what it is that you're saying. Now, don't act like you're some Socratic professor and you're testing employees to see if they really understand. But ask questions the way a colleague or co-worker. Remember, even if you're in a management position and you have subordinates, you are still co-workers. You each have different roles to help the organization achieve its goals. And one of the things that you should keep in mind when you're asking these questions to make sure that you're not insulting them or talking down to them is to read the employee's body language. If their arms are crossed, that's a sure sign that there's resistance or some type of anger or fear. So read the body language to ask questions to make sure that you understand what it is they're thinking, feeling, and interpreting. And also anticipate that when you're giving new communications to an employee, that they're going to need time to process whatever it is that you're telling them. So don't be afraid of silence. Silence can be a good thing. So the key takeaway here is to remember that questions indicate intelligence and interest. Probably one of the worst things that a manager can experience is saying something to employees and getting absolutely no questions and no feedback on it. If employees are not responding to your communications, then they might be apathetic and disengaged, which is a sure sign that poor communication is rampant within your organization. So, in conclusion, I think George Bernard Shaw probably said it best. The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Once again, never assume. Be proactive in your communication so that you can create a dialogue with your employees. And in that way, you'll have a more proactive, responsive, and high achieving organization.